hello again. I recognize some names there. Happy to see you. As you know, I'll lose my talking head if I can find it again. Anyway, again, thanks to Catherine, and thanks for joining me again. As you know, I'm a master wildlife conservationist with DEEP, and I'm very happy to always speak to you and teach you about all the cool animals that we have in our state. So here we go. There are moose in them in our woods, maybe not near woods, but they are in our woods in the state. Moose are the largest members of the deer family. They weigh as much as 1,500 pounds. They can grow to be 5 to 7 feet from hooves to shoulders. Imagine that. So their heads will tower above the biggest jacked up Ram truck you've ever seen. This, of course, when I said from 5 to 7 from hooves to shoulders, that does not include a raised head or antlers. So it's safe to say that the majority of moose tower over all non-basketball players. Although its appearance is very different from other deer, a moose is a deer. Not only that, they are the largest member of the deer family, one of the largest deer of all time, and the largest land animal in Europe and North America. They are large ungulates, which means hoofed mammals. They are identified by their long, rounded snouts. You can see that right there. This photo is by recently retired Paul Fusco, who was the photographer for DEEP for many, many years. They have huge, flattened, kind of palmated antlers, as you can see. Sometimes those can weigh 25 pounds a piece. Imagine carrying that on your head. I always imagine when they lose one first, you know, when they're running, imagine walking around with the other one on one side of your head. And they have massive bodies, as you do know. And as I said, they live in the northern United States. They prefer cooler climates, Canada and Europe. In North America, they are called moose. In Europe, they are called Eurasian elk. A lot of their animals they call Eurasian, something like the otters that I saw in Owl and Mull in Scotland. They call Eurasian otters, and they are spectacular little critters. Moose is an Algonquin. That's a Native American tribe that's in the east. It's a term that means twig eater, and they do eat twigs. They browse a lot of twigs. Male moose are called bulls. Females are called cows, so very similar to cattle. Young moose of either sex is a calf. The plural of moose is moose, not meese, or not mooses. The plural is the same as the singular in many words that come from Native American languages. The same is true of many wildlife names not of Indian origin, such as deer, mink, and grouse. Okay, so, oops, I didn't mean to. So I guess, do you guys see those yellow lines, Catherine?
I do.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have no idea how these happen. I thought I got rid of them. So I guess you're just going to have to see them. So I thought they were only on the first. So anyway, sorry about that. So these are some pictures of moose, elk, caribou, and deer. So you can kind of see the scale of them. There are different types of horns. If you've been out west in the Rocky Mountains and other places out west, you've seen those elk antlers. If you've been up to Alaska or parts of Canada, you've seen the caribou, and of course we have the deer. Here's a moose moving along. Again, as I said, they are large ungulates, which means hoofed mammals. They are again identified by that long rounded snout. Very prehistoric looking. I always thought when I first saw the first one I ever saw up in Maine in a canoe, it was like, oh my gosh. I mean, I knew it was a moose, but it was pretty prehistoric looking. They're arguably the most novel of all North American large mammals, if for no other reason than their strange appearance. Whereas deer and elk are handsome creatures, sort of. I mean, you know, attractive. I mean, who doesn't like Bambi, right? Rams are majestic and bears are awe-inspiring. Moose seem to suggest that the creator had a strange sense of humor when the moose was created. They have horse legs, bison shoulders, a camel's face, and a throat beard that would have made Henry David Thoreau envious. Even though the horns are weird, looking less like antlers as we traditionally know them, they look more like giant butterfly wings or palmated wooden bowls, but they're pretty cool. I guess you could say that moose look prehistoric, as I said, which is misleading because they're actually a relatively modern creature. Although in Europe and Asia, there was evidence of moose date back hundreds of thousands of years. They did come to America via the Siberian-Alaska land bridge. And and most researchers think that the significant moose dispersal happened only about 10,000 years ago, which isn't that long for some of our native animals. Compare this to the white-tailed deer that has been kicking around the Americas for about 3.5 million years. So quite a difference, as you see. The Irish elk, or Megaloceros giganteus, ranged across northern Eurasia from Siberia to Ireland. It shed its giant antlers every year, as our moose do. And right now, a lot of the antlers have been rutted and shed in the forest. This is a good time to find, deer shed or even moose shed. Although with our population under 100 moose, not as easy to find those. And they're mostly confined to Heartland, Colebrook, and more northern areas of the state. Anyway, this skeleton is on display in the Hall of Fossils in the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. So if you go to DC, you can see it. As a name, Irish elk is a double misnomer. The animal thrived in Ireland, but was not exclusively Irish, ranging across Europe to Western Siberia from some 400,000 years ago. So quite old. So here you can see the modern Alaskan moose, which is the largest of our moose, and the extinct broad-fronted moose. The broad-fronted moose was a large moose-like deer of the Holarctic regions of Europe and Asia, so more up in the Arctic area, some 200,000 years ago. Here you can kind of see the moose and their subspecies. There are 8 subspecies of moose in the world. 4 of these are Eurasian subspecies, including the European moose in the red there, the Siberian or Yakut moose, that's in the blue, the West Siberian or Ussuri moose, that's in the green, and the East Siberian or Kolyma moose, as you can see up there in the yellow. Eurasia, Siberia, Sweden, Norway, and the Baltic region, about 1.5 to 2 million moose are in those 12 countries. So that's a lot. Also, in the European part of Russia, the moose was nearly extinct in the 1920s. But by protection of the moose against hunting, the population has about tripled since then. In Asia, the more northern, colder climates areas are the main habitat for moose, as you can clearly see there by the map. There are 4 subspecies in North America. They do, as I said, inhabit mostly the northern parts of North America, as you can see by the map. These 4 species, as are recognized, the eastern moose, so you see in the blue there, Alsace americana, and it inhabits eastern Canada, the northeastern US, only in the most northern part. The northwestern moose, you can see in the green there. It inhabits central Canada, North Dakota, Minnesota, and northern Michigan. The Shiraz moose, which inhabits the Rocky Mountains in the US and Canada, and the Alaskan moose, as you can see up there, as I said, is our largest moose, which inhabits Alaska, northwestern Canada. In addition to the differences in geographical distribution, these different subspecies of moose are further distinguished by features such as size, pelage, and antler characteristics. The differences in regional body sizes appears to reflect adaptation to their local conditions. Animals are very good at adapting to where they are. Limited to the Rocky Mountains as far south as Colorado and to the eastern states bordering Canada, the population is still extending because of protection. But again, in Connecticut, because of climate change, things are getting warmer here. Moose are subject to winter ticks, which will get hundreds of thousands, can get on a young yearling's body, and by the time it comes out in the spring, it's totally anemic and dies. And brainworm, which moose get when there's too big of a population of deer in the area. In general, the appearance of the North American moose They have a more bright saddle area than Europeans ones, and they don't have darker legs and face. The antlers have approximately double the weight of the ones in Europe species. In Canada, there's approximately, 750,000 moose in 9 provinces and 3 territories. Pretty amazing. In the US and 15 states only, there's approximately 250,000 moose. So that includes Alaska, Colorado, in New England, obviously Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Connecticut, and parts of Massachusetts. So here you see it's a singularly clumsy looking animal, but I think beautiful as well. So Maine has the largest density of moose. They say they have around 30,000. Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Newfoundland have about 110,000. In central Ontario, Hudson Bay, and the Great Lakes, and expanding down to Connecticut, where, as I said, we have a population of under 100. After moose hunting was forbidden between 1935 and 1980 in Maine, the number of moose increased from 7,000 in 1950 to 20,000 in 1990, and then 30,000 currently. That's a good example of how human interaction influences moose and other animal populations. Also, a good example for the southerly expansion is the population in Connecticut. There were no attested reports of moose in Connecticut before 1956. There were some sporadic reports noted in the early 1900s, but never verified. Moose, as I said, are a little not too happy with our environment now, and some are moving back north. So the Shiraz moose, as you see here, kind of unusual looking antlers there. They're found in Glacier National Park and parts of the Rockies. It's the smallest moose and weighs only 600 to 800 pounds. Pretty darn big though, huh? Let's see. So this is the northwestern moose. It's found in the upper Michigan Peninsula, Minnesota, North Dakota, and surrounding areas. And this one I always thought didn't really want its picture taken, if you can see. The Alaska moose, as you can see, is much larger. It's called the giant moose. It's a subspecies of moose that ranges from Alaska to western Yukon. The Alaska moose is the largest North American subspecies of moose, as I said. Male Alaska moose can stand over 6.9 feet at the shoulder and weigh over 1,400 pounds. The antlers on the average have a span of 5.9 feet, but up to 7 feet. Imagine that on your head. Female Alaska moose stand on average 5.9 feet at the shoulder and can weigh close to 1,054 pounds. The largest Alaska moose was shot in the western Yukon in September 1897. It weighed 1,808 pounds and was 7.6 feet tall from the feet to the shoulders. Pretty big. So here's a little comparison you can see here of the Irish elk, moose, and our moose, and a deer, and a man. So here's the range again, sort of a better view. Moose per kilometers, and you see the dark green is where the highest populations are. And you can see that over in Maine, parts of Maine have a big population of moose. States scaled by moose population. You can see Alaska is much better. Moose were abundant in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire in the 1600s, but by the 1800s, they had declined because of habitat loss and unregulated hunting, much like a lot of our other animals. And during the late 1800s, with the abandonment of agriculture, of forest stands, if we talked about with other species, moose and other wildlife species rebounded. Again, Maine now has a healthy population of around 30,000, and you can see these other states there. So in the late 1900s, you can see the expansion of the moose. In 1992, Connecticut started tracking moose, and from 1992 to 1999, we had 6 sightings a year. from 2000 to 2014, we had sightings in 27 different towns. In 1996, the state started including hunter sightings. Between 2015 and 2019, there were sightings in 76 different towns. In 2008, there was an estimate of about 73 moose. And at that time, we figured that the moose would grow to 258 over a 20-year period. But these numbers are now pretty unlikely because of the three things I said before. As I said, we have somewhere around 100, maybe a little less, mostly in northwestern Connecticut and a few in northeastern Connecticut. So these are sightings of cows and their calves. As you can see, they are up there. I live in Barkhamsted, so up in that area, Colebrook, Heartland, and then you can see some of those northeastern border towns there. Moose can live up to their mid-20s, but they are susceptible to parasites, disease, malnutrition, and in populated areas, of course, collision with automobiles. They're very dark animals. We have very dark roads, and even an animal as big as a moose sometimes is hard to see on the road, even though sometimes they trot across the road, sometimes they just kind of amble their way. But another thing that makes them unusual or unable for a motorist to see is they are often quite taller than the most jacked up trucks, so you can't see the eye shine in their eyes. They do have eye shine, but they tend to be above the headlights, even your bright lights. So in New England, there are no predators capable of taking a healthy adult moose, but elsewhere in their range, grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions would take those down. In New England, regulated hunting seasons by special permit do occur in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. So according to our moose biologist, Andy Labont, he says the future for moose in Connecticut is pretty grim. Again, those reasons are disease, heat stress, winter ticks, limited quantity of good habitat, vehicle collisions, and also even competition for food with deer. Predation is low, but moose in winter and sometimes calves can fall prey to coyotes, black bear, and of course, humans. So what are challenges with motorists and moose? They're mostly active at dusk and dawn. They're dark color. They're large moose. 1 out of 50 moose vehicular accidents wind up in the death of motorists. The moose often die. This was an accident in New Canaan. The moose, you can see, kind of went right through there. So they hit your car. It's bad enough with a deer, but pretty crazy with moose. You can see this right here. Pretty sad. I say over and over again, we do drive much too fast, particularly at night when we can't see things. Again, here's that other car where they crashed with the moose. You can see the moose in the background. Historically, it's unclear if moose were ever native in Connecticut. There are no records or archaeological deposits of moose, and no mention of the animal in what are called ethno-historical accounts. A lot of settlers did write down a lot of things. Considered a cold climate species, again, they did range once as far south as Pennsylvania in the northeastern US, but with New England's transformation from forested to agrarian landscape in the colonial times, they largely disappeared. And then, though, in the 1980s, a breeding population began to reestablish itself. Now, Massachusetts, just north of us, obviously boasts some 1,000 to 1,500 moose. If they were native to Connecticut, they were likely very low numbers. The Connecticut Board of Fisheries and Game, which is kind of the precursor to DEEP Wildlife Division, they had received sporadic reports of moose, as I said, in the early 1900s and throughout the 30s. However, a photograph taken by a resident in Ashford, which again is northeastern Connecticut, in September of 1956, was considered the first official photograph that recorded the presence of moose in Connecticut. In more recent times, the Wildlife Division has received a report of a moose sighting from 1984 on up to now. By 99, the sightings increased by 6 per year. The first moose vehicle accident occurred in Connecticut in 1995. It's pretty hard to not record a moose when you hit a moose because no one's going to be moving it very easily. The moose did get certain cachet in one of our founding fathers. If you like esoteric books, you know me, I always like to include literature. This is pretty interesting. So America is a swamp, that's the problem. That's what a French nobleman, Count George Louis Letteric Buffon, had an explanation. He was a great Parisian intellectual, a friend of Ben Franklin, a writer. And though he'd never been to America, he had read some travel accounts, made notes, and decided that America's flaw was built in and deeply environmental. The continent, he declared, was mostly swamp and had only recently lifted itself up out of the sea. He had a dim view of us, I guess. It was still drying out, he thought, so anything that lived there could not compete with a drier, hardier, more bracing climate in Europe. That's why he claimed that American animals and plants were smaller, more fragile, and less diverse. His book also included comparative tables that he cobbled together from various written accounts, none of them verifiable. Life in America, he concluded, was a diminished second best version of Europe, a degenerate copy. There's a lot of moose in North America. In Europe, they're usually called elk. Count Buffon, it's Buffon, well, in case you wondered, decided that animals that size couldn't exist in such a diminished environment. He figured some local must have seen a reindeer and morphed it into a grandly oversized cartoon animal with big antlers. So Jefferson got wind of this. He knew this guy. He begged to differ. He told Buffon that a reindeer is pitiable next to the American moose, which is largely true, except for they bring our presents at Christmas. As he recounted the conversation later, he told the Count the reindeer could walk under the belly of our moose. So in the years after Revolutionary War, our republic was kind of fledgling, and it was viewed by many Europeans as degenerate backwater, and it was populated by weak and feeble subspecies. So chief among these was this Count, and he said, again, the flora and fauna here was inferior to Europe. So Jefferson spent many years trying to counter this conception of American degeneracy to Europe. His notes on Virginia systematically and scientifically dismantled Buffon's case through a series of tables and compelling writing on the nature of his home state. But it did little to counter the arrogance of the Frenchman, and it hardly satisfied Jefferson's quest to demonstrate that his young nation was every bit the equal of a well-established Europe. Enter the giant moose. The American moose, which Jefferson claimed was so enormous that reindeer could walk under it, was the cornerstone of his defense. Convinced that the sight of such a beast would cause Buffon to revise his claims, he had the remains of a 7-foot moose shipped first class from New Hampshire to Paris. Unfortunately, the Count died before he could make any revisions to his book. But the legend of the moose makes for a fascinating tale about Jefferson's passion to prove that his American deserved prestige. So this book, Mr. Jefferson, the Giant Moose, the author recreates the origin and evolution of the debates about natural history in America, not just the moose, and in doing so returns the prize moose to its rightful place in American history. So that's a little side note. You all know I like side notes. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting book. I have read it. So moose, they're great size, long legs, short neck, and palmate antlers. Antlers distinguish it from other ungulates. Their long legs allow adult moose to handle snow depths up to 36 inches. Those muscular shoulders you see there make the moose appear humped, and they have a characteristic bell of skin you can see known as the dewlap, which hangs from their neck. Moose are very large, as I said. They do have long, slender, grayish white legs. You won't mistake them for anything else if you're driving, say, in northwestern Connecticut and you see it. Both cows and bulls have variable coat colors, though, and they can range from tan to blackish brown, depending on the age of the moose and the season. They do have an annual molt in the spring. Males have a more blackish face, while the female's face is brown. And again, they both have that skin flap or bell underneath their throat, but the bull's is larger than that of the cows. So again, very distinguishable. So the males do have very impressive antlers, which are shed annually. They begin to grow in early spring. They're fully developed by late summer, when the males will start scraping the velvet off the antlers by rubbing against trees and shrubs. And you can often see these tree rubs pretty high up. So sometimes you might see something up pretty high, and that could be what it is. These palmate branched antlers can weigh close to 60 pounds together and spread to more than 5 feet across. Male calves sometimes develop what are called button antlers, and in deer they're called button bucks, and yearlings usually develop little spikes, so it takes them a while to get that big, those big horns. Again, as I said, look at that, they can weigh up to 60 pounds. That's a lot to lug around on their heads. And again, I think it must feel pretty funny if they shed one before the other. Again, if you look at these compared to thinking of a deer's antlers, they do look like open palms or with the fingers pounding down, or males. So again, they lose their antlers in December usually, and they'll begin to grow a new set in April and reach full size in June. So it's kind of fun to go bushwhacking if we had snow on the ground. It's kind of hard to find stuff, you know, with the brownish terrain we have right now. Although a friend of mine, Jake, who's known as the Moose Man, he has a giant moose antlers that he does loan me sometimes for my talks. And I think you might see one of those if it was in the woods. It's pretty darn big. But when they first grow these big antlers, they have this velvet covering, and it does peel off in August when they rub it off. And the blood supply begins to become cut off to those antlers, and that's when the velvet comes off. But these antlers are a symbol of strength and virility that's intended to impress females and intimidate their rivals. They will often fight each other and sometimes get their antlers locked. That's true of deer as well. They are used for fighting for a mate, and so they do come handy against wolves. Also, moose can kick, so they fight pretty hard if they're attacked. If they are attacked by a pack of wolves, they usually will succumb. Again, shed hunting season usually starts in February and usually ends up around the end of March. A lot of animals eat antlers in the woods. So if you ever find an antler where it's a deer antler or a moose shed, look closely, you'll probably find little gnaw marks on it, just kind of like the antlers people buy for their dogs to chew on. Sheds can be found throughout the year, but sometimes they may be gnawed away a little bit. And you can take them, it's legal. So the main focus of shed hunting is within these 2 months, February and March. So this dog is a shed hunting dog. It's a yellow lab, and apparently this hunter told me this dog is very, very good at finding shed. And you can see these are some of its trophy. So all animals have to have good habitat to survive. This friend of mine, Janet Pesatoro, she's a PhD biologist, and she's also the author of a book called Game Camera Trapping Guide, Track, Sign, and Behavior of Eastern Wildlife. She's very generous and lets me use a lot of her photos. I encourage you to look up her book. I get no cut from it, but she does have field guides in there of most of our animals in New England. She lives in Massachusetts, so this is one of her photos. Excuse me, gotta take a sip of water. Moose are typically associated with forests throughout Northern Asia, Northern Europe, and North America. These are boreal forests, that's B-O-R-E-A-L. They consist of pines, spruces, and larch trees, so they prefer those types. Moose habitat also includes open tundra, obvious, where conifers such as dwarf birch, alder, and willows grow, surrounded by lakes and bogs and streams. If you're paddling, you know, in Maine, on any pond or lake or bog, you can oftentimes see moose. They prefer regions where the average annual temperature is not above 60 degrees. So you can see why they have a challenge here now. So their habitat selection, though, is governed by forage availability, finding stuff to eat. So they do inhabit forests with more cover to avoid late summer heat and deep snow and harsh winters. They also will select habitats with the best combination of cover and food quality to use as calving sites. They can occupy the same range throughout the year, or they might migrate between summer and winter habitats depending on the weather and their residence and food availability. Moose that occupy flat terrain do move from habitat with aspen or willow stands in the summer to these dense conifer forests in the winter. So like most animals, they have to move to find their food. With huge size comes a huge appetite. Moose are browsers. They'll casually devour 73 pounds in a day in the summer and 34 pounds in the winter. So it takes a lot of food. They eat an assortment, as you see here, of shrubs, woody plants, aquatic vegetations. In the winter, their diet is more restricted, obviously, as is most animal diets. So they eat the buds of plants. They can store 100 pounds of food in their stomachs. Pretty amazing, huh? Their rutting season begins in September. Again, this is Paul Fusco, who's enjoying his retirement. And I'm so happy that I can share his photos. But it begins in September. At this time, the bull's neck swells and the bull feeds very little, and it does lose a lot of weight. Both bulls and cows travel in search of a mate. And bulls can actually breed as yearlings, which is young a lot of times for male animal species. But older bulls usually dominate breeding activities. Cows can breed at 1.5 years old during the rut. Sparring matches may occur between bulls as they defend their right to mate with a cow. And these can be very aggressive encounters, and sometimes they result in injury and sometimes in death. Bull moose rut pits are used during courtships. There are these pits that they dig with their front hoofs and then they urinate into. Animals are very big about scent marking. They scent mark all the time. They also scent mark when they're mating. A fisher is really renowned for like that. Those little things just pee all the time. I don't know. And so do otters. Otter latrines you can really smell around marshes and waterways. But anyway, they make these pits. And receptive cows will often step into the pit and vocalize to the bull moose, calling it. And some of these vocalizations can include grunts, moans, and whines. Again, mating season begins in mid-September through October in New England areas. The bull moose can, again, become very aggressive at this time. I often tell people you probably want to be more afraid of seeing a moose, particularly during rutting season, mating season, than a black bear. If you see a moose, it sounds silly and funny and like a Disney movie, but if it's coming towards you and you have nowhere to go, well, if you're good at climbing trees, you can climb a tree because obviously they can't climb a tree. They can swim, so the water's not going to help you. They can run, so you can kind of get behind a big tree and keep going around and around and hope it kind of loses its interest. But anyway, they will fight, as I said, other males over their receptive cows. And when they make those rut pits, they can be 3 to 6 inches deep. So you can, if you're in moose territory, you can often see these. They, again, do attract the females. So they will wallow in the rut pit, when they're thinking about mating. So it's kind of interesting. This is kind of a picture of one, probably not a place we'd like to wallow or have our kids wallow while they're walking along. So in late May or June, following a gestation period of about 8 months, the cows will give birth to a 20 to 25 pound calf. Twins are not uncommon in moose, although helpless at birth, which always cracks me up, but all the biologists always say they're helpless at birth, but so are we. But anyway, they become agile after only a few days, though. They grow very rapidly, and they will remain with their mother during the first year. Female moose or cows generally have 1 to 2 calves again in May. When they first are born, they can't run, so they are vulnerable to predators, but the mom kind of watches them pretty closely. And she will stay with them and fight off any predators that try to pick off her young. So moose senses, moose have a strong sense of smell and hearing, but they have poor eyesight. They're nearsighted, which does help them browse for water plants, but doesn't help them see danger far off. And they can run. They are athletes despite their megalithic stature and gangly appearance. They are very fast runners. When they decide to bolt out of their typical trot, they have been clocked at 35 to 40 miles per hour. Usain Bolt, move over. They can run for 10 miles without stopping, which is much longer than deer. But sometimes their size deceives them. This is a young bull moose that was, we think, probably going after a female and got itself stuck on a fence at the Barkhamsted Reservoir. So the fire department came over, the Incon Deep Police, everybody came over, and they had to, cut some of these iron bars to get this young moose out. And as far as they could tell, it was okay. Moose hide is pretty thick, so it did survive, but it was quite the thing to see. So a moose is an excellent example of a cold tolerant species. Their large body size, long legs, and warm coats make them extremely well adapted to winter. Of the northern ungulates, they are perhaps best adapted to cold. So they have this special gait when they are moving in the snow that help them navigate the depths. They have exceptional long angle, as you can see, between their shin bone and their tibia and metatarsus of the hind leg. So that gives them kind of an angle that helps them really push through that snow easily. I'd like to cross country ski behind them. It's hard to break trails, but I don't know. We haven't seen snow like this in a while. They're excellent swimmers. They can move their heavy bodies at about 6 miles per hour. They could swim neck and neck with Michael Phelps because his fastest was about 6 miles per hour. But after a couple of 100 meters, Phelps will start fading, and the moose could keep that pace for another 2 hours. They're born knowing how to swim. Why do moose swim? They love to swim, and they often dive underwater and swim for extended periods of time to stay cool on hot days. They can close their nostrils. Some other animals, like beaver, has this ability that gives them the ability to graze underwater. Their respiration rate also slows down when they are in the water, which allows them to stay underwater for long periods. Another upshot is spending so much time in the water. It does prolong their life. Seriously, if you think about people who've had injuries, oftentimes they're told to walk around in a pool. Standing around in water all day takes some of the stress off their big, heavy bone, their bodies and their bones and joints. Kind of like water aerobics, lower impact than running, which reduces their chances of osteoporosis and arthritis. Yes, animals can get this, and I don't think people are handing out ibuprofen to them. Also, just being in a couple of feet of water does discourage predators, even though a lot of predators can swim, like wolves and mountain lions, from attacking them, because it's a lot harder to sneak up on something that's surrounded by water. A charging moose can come at you at 35 miles per hour. So don't look them in the eye, because males are territorial and irritable during the rut, and they will take staring them in the eye as an aggressive posture, and stomping your feet is a sign that you want to go a few rounds with him. So it's best to avoid all three unless you can run up to 36 miles per hour. When cornered, moose fight back fiercely with their front feet and antlers. Teddy Roosevelt is known for saying, "I feel as fit as a bull moose." His party was called the Bull Moose Party. A single blow from a powerful moose hooves can kill or cripple a human, a bear, or a wolf. While hunting on a hunting trip, Teddy Roosevelt was charged by a bull moose. He wrote afterward, "It came at him at a slashing trot, shaking his head his ears back, the hair on his withers bristling. He shot it when it was not 30 feet off. Describing his encounter with a 7-foot female moose, Colorado Rep. Bob Schaefer said, she had a look in her eyes saying, I don't know who you are, but I'm going to kill you. So moose encounters, but they can be very awesome. They do tend to feed on willow tips, the shoots of maples and other trees, bark, twigs, branches, leaves, cones, buds of trees and shrubs. Here you see a moose rub, pretty clear that it's pretty high up. You can't see any claw marks like you'd see with a bear. They seem to love succulent aquatic plants such as water lilies best, and they can often be seen in ponds, wading in marshes, periodically dipping their head on the water to bring up plants. And oftentimes, you know, you'll see photos with plants in their mouths. And sometimes after they dip their head down, you'll see them raising their head and there'll be plants hanging from their antlers. But the problem is aquatic plants don't contain a lot of nutrients. It's now believed that one reason moose eat them is to get enough salt, which is necessary for good health, but isn't found in great quantities in terrestrial plants. So here you can see them eating at the twigs, you know, and you can always tell the difference in how a moose breaks a twig, a deer breaks a twig, any other critter. There's always little signs. There's even signs on tiny little critters and how each one opens an acorn. So animals do leave a lot of sign in the forest, and it's kind of fun to try to learn those signs. They do use their bottom incisors as chisels to scrape upwards and strip the bark off trees. Evidence of a moose in the area is include plants and trees sniffed off at a height of, you know, pretty high, as you can see. Pin moose in Alaska are fed a mixture of aspen, sawdust, ground corn, oats, and barley, cane molasses, soybean meal, and added vitamins. And no, please don't put those unnatural things in your yard to attract moose. But anyway, a captive moose or a moose that can't be returned to the wild, sawdust is a good substitute for the woody material that a moose would usually eat. Again, here you can see how they've stripped off this part of this tree. They have pretty big hooves, as you can see, pretty distinctive, kind of hard to mistake from other animals. This is a moose walking. I was out canoeing in the Adirondacks, and there was a little beach area, and I got off and was able to see these tracks. I waited around for quite a while, but never saw the moose. The front tracks can be 4.5 to 7 inches in length and 3 3/4 to 6 inches in width. So, you know, that's pretty much bigger than your hand. They have 4 toes, 2 of which are dew claws raised up on the back side of their leg. Their dew claws on the front feet splay out to the sides. The hooves are kind of heart-shaped. The front tracks are larger than the rear tracks. So again, here you see, whenever you're trying to determine what kind of track, except for probably a moose track, is pretty obvious. Always have something for scale, for size. You can see this boot on the right is pretty much the moose tracks as big as that. Here's our moose droppings. They vary with diet. So sometimes, this is true of deer as well and other animals. Sometimes they could be a little bigger than this, sometimes this way. So that's another sign. Moose are dying at an alarming rate. Again, they are succumbing to conditions such as brainworm, severe winter tick infestations, which is the top right there, from bacterial infections, from injuries and liver flukes, and other undetermined health issues that are being studied. Here's some of those winter ticks on the left, and this is what a moose will look like after having all those winter ticks feeding on it. Again, these photos are by our moose biologist, Andy Labont. Here's moose crossing a road. As you can see, they are really, really much bigger than a car. So they're going to do quite a bit of damage on even an SUV like that pickup SUV type truck in the background. So here are some moose calls. I'll play for you. Now we know that's a bull calling, right? And here's another. I bet you don't even know what the heck. So that's kind of like a mating call, but like an eagle, bugle, or a werewolf, huh? And then another. So you can see they make quite a few different calls. I remember I went out west on a grizzly research mission, and I got in really, really late to where I was staying because I always never just go from A to B. I always take side trips. And I heard this sound. I'm like, it was kind of eerie because I was stuck out, I was by myself. Turns out it was elk, trumpeting. And, I probably heard it on shows and stuff, but it's different when you're out by yourself. And I was trying to change. So this is a moose I took a picture of in Bark Hampstead. So from my car, and this was a young one, but you can see they're pretty